Sweat stung Casey's eyes as she thumbed a heavy brass cartridge into the scratched chamber. 5 enemy snipers had Bravo team pinned in a pulverized concrete intersection. Blood pooled around O'Neill's boots. He was the loudest one, laughing at her beat-up, mismatched rifle 3 hours ago back at the staging area. Nobody was laughing now, just the sharp, unforgiving crack of her bolt action breaking the silence. 2 minutes, 5 targets, 1 battered gun to keep them all breathing. Let's go. The armory smelled like burnt ozone, CLP solvent, and the stale sweat of men trying too hard not to look nervous. Forward operating base. Viper was a temporary scar on the landscape, a cluster of blast walls and canvas tents baking under a relentless sun. Inside the makeshift gear room, the air conditioner rattled violently, spitting lukewarm air over the weapons racks. Casey Miller sat at the far end of the plywood workbench, isolated in her focus. She was the new variable in an old equation. Bravo team had been operating together for 3 years. They knew each other's ticks, wives, and poker tells. Casey knew their dossiers. It wasn't the same. The trident pinned to her uniform meant she had passed the same grueling pipeline, suffered the same hypothermia in the surf, and carried the same logs on the grinder. But out here, where the paperwork dissolved into dust, a patch didn't buy trust. Blood did. Her hands, heavily calloused and marked with a network of pale scars, moved over her rifle with practiced reverence. To an outsider, the weapon looked like a salvage yard mistake. It was built on a decades-old Remington 700 short action she had scavenged and polished by hand until the bolt cycled with the smoothness of glass on ice. The chassis was dented aluminum, completely stripped of its original factory finish, scarred by rocks and door frames. The heavy contour barrel was wrapped in frayed, scorched thermal tape to mitigate mirage. The scope, though boasting world-class German glass, sat in a housing that looked like it had been used as a hammer. She had painted it herself with rattle-can khaki and brown a paint job that was currently chipping off in large, ugly flakes. "Are you entirely sure that thing isn't going to blow up in your face, Miller?" The voice belonged to O'Neill. He was leaning against a concrete pillar, aggressively chewing a wad of tobacco, holding his own pristine factory-issued Mark 22 advanced sniper rifle. It was a beautiful piece of modern engineering, modular, sleek, and utterly devoid of personality. Casey didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the bolt face, wiping away an invisible speck of carbon with a microfiber cloth. "It holds a group. That's all it needs to do. Holds a group." O'Neill scoffed, spitting a stream of brown liquid into a plastic water bottle. He looked at Donovan, the team's heavy weapons specialist, who was busy relinking a belt of ammunition. "You hear that the rust bucket holds a group. I guess we don't need precision engineering anymore. Just duct tape and happy thoughts." Donovan chuckled softly, not lifting his head. "Leave her alone, O'Neill. If she wants to bring a musket to a gunfight, that's her funeral. I just don't want it to be our funeral." O'Neill pressed, stepping closer. The hostility wasn't purely about the gun. The gun was a proxy. It was the excuse. He looked down at the scratched fiberglass stock. "You're supposed to be our overwatch tonight. We're moving through the industrial ruins. If we get pinned, I need to know the person covering my 6 has gear that didn't come from a pawn shop." Casey finally stopped moving. She placed the bolt down on the rag. The silence in the room stretched thick and heavy. Even the rattling air conditioner seemed to hold its breath. She looked up at O'Neill. Her eyes were flat, dead calm, entirely devoid of the defensive anger he was trying to provoke. "O'Neill." She said, her voice quiet, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear her. "This receiver has 5,000 rounds through it. The barrel has 1,000. I know exactly how much it drops at 600 yards in a crosswind. I know the creep of the trigger down to the millimeter. You have a beautiful gun, but you look at it. I don't look at mine. I look through it. O'Neill stared at her, his jaw working the tobacco. He wanted a fight. He wanted her to raise her voice so he could label her emotional unstable, unfit for the tight-knit brotherhood of Tier 1 operators. But she gave him nothing, just cold, absolute certainty. All right, enough. Aldrich, the team leader, stepped into the armory. He was a broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered granite and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He carried the weight of command with a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion. "Gear check in 10. Aldrich barked his voice, leaving no room for debate. He looked at O'Neill, then down at Casey's workbench. His eyes lingered on the battered rifle for a fraction of a second. "Miller, you confident in your primary?" "Yes, boss," Casey said, picking up the bolt and sliding it smoothly into the receiver. The click-clack of the metal engaging was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the weapon's outward appearance. "Good, because intel says the city is crawling with hostiles, not just low-level insurgents, organized militia. We're going in to extract a downed pilot, and we are not coming back empty-handed. O'Neill, pack your bags. Donovan, load heavy. We roll at 2,100. As the men dispersed to finalize their kits, Casey ran her thumb over the chipped paint of her scope housing. The squad laughed at the rifle because they didn't understand it. They saw an ugly tool. They didn't see the nights she spent hand-loading ammunition, measuring powder down to the grain, testing the concentricity of every bullet. They didn't see the math. In a world of chaos, the rifle was pure physics. It didn't care about gender or brotherhoods or O'Neill's fragile ego. It only cared about gravity, velocity, and drag. She slammed a 5-round magazine into the magwell. It seated with a heavy, satisfying thud. Let them laugh. The helicopter ride was a sensory deprivation chamber of darkness and deafening noise. The Black Hawk skimmed the earth, flying nap of the earth to avoid early warning radar. The vibration traveled up through the floorboards, rattling Casey's teeth. She sat near the open door, the wind tearing at her uniform, smelling the thick, oily stench of JP-8 jet fuel, mixed with the dry, dusty air of the desert night. Through her panoramic night vision goggles, the world was painted in stark, high-contrast shades of phosphor green. The landscape below was a jagged wasteland of bombed-out buildings and cratered roads. This was a city that had been dying for a decade, its bones exposed, its streets choked with the rubble of forgotten airstrikes. "1 minute," the crew chief shouted over the comms, holding up a single finger. Casey double-checked her retention lanyard. Her battered rifle was slung tightly across her chest, taped and secured so it wouldn't make a sound. The bird flared dust, swallowing the landing zone. They didn't even touch down. At 3 feet off the ground, the team stepped out into the swirling maelstrom of dirt and debris. Casey hit the ground, running her boots, finding traction on shattered concrete. Within seconds, the Black Hawk banked hard and disappeared into the night, taking the deafening roar with it. The sudden silence of the city was worse than the noise. "Hold!" Aldrich whispered over the encrypted squad net. They crouched in the shadows of a collapsed parking garage. Casey scanned their sector, her rifle up the green glow of her optics, turning the ruins into a ghostly labyrinth. Rebar jutted from broken pillars like twisted, rusting ribs. Abandoned cars rusted in the streets, stripped of anything valuable. "Move out," staggered Column. They moved like ghosts. Aldrich on point, O'Neill and Donovan in the middle, Griggs handling comms, and Casey pulling rear security. For 4 hours they navigated the dead city. The physical exertion was immense. Every step required calculation, avoiding broken glass that would crunch, stepping over unstable rubble, scanning endless rows of shattered windows. The tactical disadvantage of an urban environment was oppressive. A threat could come from a sewer grate, a third-story window, or an alleyway. 360 degrees of potential death. As dawn began to break, the phosphor-green world dissolved into harsh, unforgiving grey. The sun crept over the horizon, casting long, deceptive shadows across the pavement. The temperature began to rise immediately, baking the dust into the air. They reached the objective zone, a wide rectangular plaza, surrounded by four-story commercial high-rises. It was an unavoidable choke point. To get to the pilot's last known location, they had to cross it. Casey knelt behind the husk of an overturned transport truck. Her instincts, honed by years of failure and survival, began to scream. The plaza was too quiet. No stray dogs, no birds, no wind whistling through the broken glass. Just a heavy, dead stillness. "Boss," Casey whispered over the net, her voice tight. "I don't like this. Too many sightlines. It's a fishbowl." O'Neill clicked his mic. "We don't have time to detour, Miller. Pilot's beacon is fading. Stop seeing ghosts." "I'm not seeing ghosts. I'm seeing architecture built for an ambush." Casey fired back, keeping her eye pressed to her optic, sweeping the dark, empty windows above. "O'Neill, shut it," Aldrich ordered. "Miller, what do you see?" "Nothing. That's the problem. It's too clean." "We cross fast." "Bounding Overwatch," Aldrich decided. "Donovan, you're up." Donovan stood taking 3 rapid steps toward the center of the plaza. The crack of the rifle didn't sound like a movie. It wasn't a clean cinematic bang. It was a vicious supersonic whip crack that tore the air apart, followed instantly by the wet, sickening thud of the bullet finding meat. Donovan spun, crying out, as a round sheared through his shoulder plate, taking a chunk of ceramic and flesh with it. He went down hard, dropping his heavy machine gun. "Contact!" Aldrich roared. Before the echo of the first shot faded, 3 more rang out. Dust erupted from the concrete barriers around them in violent, jagged spurts. Crack, crack, crack. "Man down, suppressing fire!" O'Neill screamed, throwing himself behind a rusted concrete planter. He blind-fired his pristine rifle over the lip, dumping an entire magazine into the empty buildings above. It was useless. Casey dove flat, her chest hitting the dirt hard. She ignored the scrape of gravel against her chin. Her brain instantly began to parse the chaos. The shots weren't overlapping in a panicked burst. They were paced, calculated. "Griggs, get on the horn. We need an evac bird now." Aldrich yelled, grabbing Donovan by the drag handle of his vest and pulling him behind the remains of a fountain. Blood was leaving a bright, wet smear across the dusty stone. "Radios are jammed," Griggs yelled back, frantically twisting dials on his chest rig. "They're washing out the frequency. We have no comms." Crack. A round slammed into the fountain inches from Aldrich's head, showering him with pulverized stone. "They've got us boxed," O'Neill yelled. His bravado entirely vanished, replaced by the raw, high-pitched edge of panic. "I can't see muzzle flashes. Where are they?" Casey pressed herself into the dirt, listening. She tuned out O'Neill's shouting. She tuned out Donovan's ragged breathing. She closed her eyes. Crack. Northwest corner elevated. Crack. East side, lower level, maybe second floor. Crack, crack. 2 shooters, south side, staggered elevations. 5 of them, Casey muttered to herself. Organized. This wasn't a random patrol. They had walked into a deliberate, pre-planned sniper nest. The enemy had let them get exactly to the center of the kill zone before springing the trap. They were using suppressed Dragunovs or something similar. Long barrels, elevated positions, crossfire. If they stayed behind the fountain and the planter, they would be picked apart. The enemy was just playing with them, bleeding them out, before maneuvering a ground force to mop them up. "Boss!" Casey yelled over the deafening snap of incoming rounds. "I need elevation." "You move, you die, Miller," Aldrich shouted back, pressing his hands against Donovan's bleeding shoulder. "Stay low. If I stay low, we all die." She didn't wait for permission. Casey grabbed her ugly, beat-up rifle and looked at the ruins of a partially collapsed pharmacy 30 yards to her left. To get there, she had to cross open ground. She took a deep breath, slowed her heart. Adrenaline was a poison if you let it control you. She pushed it down, transforming the fear into cold, mechanical focus. She exploded from cover. The air around Casey turned into a hornet's nest of supersonic lead. Asphalt chewed up in violent grey geysers inches from her boots. She didn't run in a straight line. She moved in an erratic, broken sprint. The heavy barrel of her rifle banged against her ribs. Crack whiz. A bullet tore through the fabric of her sleeve, grazing the skin. She didn't feel it. She hit the pharmacy doorway hard, diving headfirst over a shattered display counter. Glass rained down on her helmet and shoulders. She slid across the debris-littered floor, coming to a halt near a collapsed stairwell. Without pausing to catch her breath, she scrambled up the broken concrete stairs on her hands and knees. The second floor was a gutted mess of drywall and exposed pipes. It gave her a commanding view of the plaza, but more importantly, it put her in the shadows. She crawled on her belly toward the blown-out window frame. The floor was covered in pulverized brick. She pushed a small pile of rubble forward to conceal her muzzle, then deployed the bipod. The metal legs snapped into place with a quiet, solid click. She settled the stock into the pocket of her shoulder. Her thumb found the safety. Her eye met the optic. The world shrank. The screaming in the plaza, the dust, the heat. It all vanished. There was only the reticle, the crosshairs, the math. Target 1, Northwest Building, 3rd floor. She scanned the dark windows. Her brain processed the environmental data automatically. Distance approximately 340 meters. Wind a mild cross breeze, maybe 5 miles per hour from the left, indicated by the swirling dust below. She saw a flicker of movement, the glint of a lens deeper inside the room. He was cocky. He was leaning out over a desk to get a better angle on Aldrich. Casey adjusted her parallax. She didn't dial the elevation turret. She knew her holds. She placed the center crosshair just on the edge of his exposed shoulder to account for the wind drift. She inhaled, exhaled halfway, held it. Her finger pressed the trigger. The break was entirely crisp, a glass rod snapping. The heavy rifle roared, kicking back against her shoulder. The recoil threw her line of sight off for a fraction of a second, but she was already working the bolt. Up, back, forward, down. The spent brass casing flew out spinning in the air, landing on the concrete with a sharp clink. Through the scope, she watched Target 1 collapse backward, his rifle falling out the window and clattering to the street below. 1. She didn't pause. Target 2. East side, 2nd floor. The shooter over there had seen Target 1 fall. He was shifting position, trying to locate the source of the heavy, booming crack that sounded entirely different from the enemy's suppressed weapons. Casey found him. He was standing behind a cinder-block wall, looking through a jagged hole. He was scanning the ground level, assuming she was still down with the squad. Distance 280 meters. No wind hold needed. She placed the crosshair squarely on the dark opening of the cinder-block hole. She breathed in, exhaled, fired. The .300 Winchester Magnum round left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It didn't just hit the hole, it punched through the edges of the cinder block, turning the concrete into secondary shrapnel. A spray of red mist exploded behind the wall. The shadow disappeared. 2. Time elapsed 24 seconds. Target 3 and 4 were on the south side. They realized what was happening. They realized the prey had grown fangs. They shifted their fire from the plaza directly to the pharmacy. Suddenly, the wall next to Casey's head disintegrated. Shards of brick and plaster blasted against her face, cutting her cheek. Dust instantly blinded her right eye. She didn't flinch. She kept her left eye open, her cheek welled, glued to the battered fiberglass stock. They were trying to suppress her. They were shooting blind into the dark window. She saw the muzzle flash of Target 3. He was on the roof, firing rapidly. She racked the bolt. The action was incredibly smooth, immune to the dust filling the air. Distance 410 meters. Elevation angle steep. She aimed low to account for the upward angle. The dust from the exploding brick around her was her concealment. She fired directly through the hanging cloud of plaster. The recoil, the racking of the bolt. Target 3 pitched forward, tumbling over the low parapet wall of the roof, plummeting 4 stories down into the plaza with a sickening crunch. 3. Time elapsed 58 seconds. Target 4 saw his partner fall. Panic finally set into the enemy's disciplined ranks. He abandoned his position, abandoning his concealment, to sprint across the rooftop toward a stairwell door. Moving target. Casey racked the bolt. Clink. Distance 410 meters. Speed full sprint lateral. She tracked him in the scope. She calculated the lead time. She needed to shoot where he was going to be, not where he was. She pushed the crosshairs ahead of his running form. 1 mil, 2 mils. She squeezed the trigger while moving the rifle, dragging the shot perfectly. Boom. The round hit him mid-stride. The kinetic energy flipped him violently off his feet. He slammed into the steel roof door and didn't move. 4. Time elapsed, 1 minute and 12 seconds. The plaza was suddenly terrifyingly quiet. The suppressing fire had stopped. Down below, O'Neill was staring up at the pharmacy, his mouth open, his pristine rifle slack in his hands. Miller. Aldrich's voice cracked over the short-range radio. "Talk to me." "Stand by. 1 unaccounted for," Casey whispered. The squad leader, the spotter, the one who had orchestrated the kill zone. Target 5. She swept the buildings. She ignored the blood running down her cheek, stinging her eye. She ignored the throbbing in her shoulder. Where would he be? He wouldn't run. He would try to take her out. He knew where she was. She saw nothing, just empty, dark windows. Then a glint, not a lens, a barrel. He was deep inside a room on the 2nd floor, diagonally across from her. He was firing through a loophole, knocked out of a reinforced concrete pillar. It was a perfect hardened position. He was entirely behind cover, save for the 2-inch gap where his rifle barrel rested. She couldn't shoot him directly. There was no flesh exposed. Casey stared at the concrete pillar. She knew the ballistics of her hand-loaded rounds. She knew the penetration capability of a solid copper projectile moving at Mach 2.5. She racked the bolt for the 5th time. She didn't aim for the loophole. She aimed 6 inches to the right directly at the solid mass of the concrete pillar, where she calculated his head and torso would be resting behind the weapon. "Armor-piercing," she murmured to the empty room. She slowed her breathing until the pounding of her heart felt like a distant drum. She fired precisely between heartbeats. The heavy rifle boomed. The 220-grain bullet struck the concrete pillar. It didn't shatter. It acted like a drill driving through the hardened material, transferring immense kinetic energy, blowing a massive hole out the backside of the pillar. The spalling concrete and the deformed bullet tore through the space behind the cover. The enemy rifle barrel clattered against the stone and slid backward, vanishing into the darkness of the room. No movement, no secondary fire. Silence descended on the ruins, heavy and absolute. Casey didn't lower her weapon. She waited. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Nothing. Time elapsed 1 minute 54 seconds. Slowly, she pulled her eye away from the scope. She reached up, wiped the mixture of sweat brick dust and blood from her cheek. She reached down, folded the bipod legs, and stood up in the shadows. She keyed her radio. Clear to move. 5 targets neutralized. Down in the plaza, Aldrich slowly stood up, keeping his weapon raised. He scanned the surrounding rooftops. Nothing moved. He looked down at Donovan, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder, but grinning through the pain. Finally, Aldrich looked at O'Neill. O'Neill was staring up at the shattered window of the pharmacy. He looked down at his own clean, unblemished, factory-perfect rifle, and then back up at the shadows where Casey was standing. The bravado, the mockery, the arrogance, it was gone, completely erased by the brutal, undeniable reality of the last 2 minutes. Casey walked down the broken stairs. She emerged into the blinding sunlight of the plaza, her uniform torn, her face coated in white plaster dust and red blood. The ugly, scratched, hand-painted monstrosity of a rifle rested easily across her chest, smoking slightly from the barrel. No one laughed. No one said a word. She walked past O'Neill without making eye contact, knelt beside Donovan to inspect his wound, and looked up at Aldrich. "We need that evac bird, boss, before the rest of their friends show up." The smell of copper and bowels flooded the dusty air. Donovan was going into shock. Casey kept her rifle trained on the upper windows while Aldrich went to work. The team leader's hands were stained crimson up to the wrists. He didn't speak. He worked with brutal, terrifying efficiency. His trauma shears ripped through Donovan's uniform and the heavy nylon of his plate carrier. The bullet had caught the edge of the ceramic plate, shattering it, sending secondary fragmentation deep into Donovan's trapezius and upper chest. "Pack it," Aldrich grunted. Griggs dropped to his knees, ripping open a foil packet of hemostatic gauze. He didn't gently dab the wound. He shoved the chemically treated fabric directly into the torn muscle cavity, packing it down hard to reach the severed artery. Donovan let out a wet, strangled scream, his back arching off the pavement. "Hold him down," Aldrich ordered. O'Neill was frozen for a fraction of a second. He was staring at the blood pooling around Donovan's boots, mixing with the white plaster dust to create a sticky, rust-colored paste. "O'Neill!" Aldrich barked. "Hold him down!" O'Neill snapped out of it. He dropped his rifle and threw his body weight over Donovan's legs, pinning him to the concrete, while Griggs finished packing the wound and applying a pressure dressing. Casey watched the perimeter through her optic. The street level was a maze of dead ends and rusted vehicles. The high ground belonged to the dead snipers, but the noise of the firefight was a dinner bell. Every hostile within 2 miles was currently triangulating their position. "Boss," Casey said, her voice flat, devoid of the panic currently bleeding out of Donovan. "We have 3 minutes before the local militia shows up to see who won the gunfight. We cannot stay in this plaza." Aldrich tied off the pressure bandage, his breathing heavy. "Griggs, tell me we have a signal." Griggs was desperately tapping the side of his PRC 152 radio. He twisted the squelch dial. Nothing but the aggressive, rhythmic hiss of electronic interference. Still jammed. It's localized. They have a localized emitter somewhere in the grid, washing out the VHF and UHF bands. I can't get a bird on the net. Aldrich wiped a bloody hand across his forehead, leaving a dark smear. He looked at Donovan, who was pale, sweating profusely, his lips turning a faint shade of blue. He couldn't walk. He definitely couldn't run. "We need a hard structure. We need to clear the jamming radius to get the evac bird. And we need to find that pilot." Aldrich laid out the impossible geometry of their situation. "O'Neill." O'Neill looked up. His face was pale beneath the dirt and camo paint. "Grab his saw." Aldrich pointed to the heavy Mark 48 machine gun lying in the dirt next to Donovan. It weighed 24 pounds unloaded. With the ammo boxes, it was a back-breaking piece of hardware. "You're on heavy weapons now." O'Neill looked at his own rifle, the lightweight modular Mark 22. It was a precision tool. The SAW was a blunt instrument. "What about my primary?" O'Neill asked. "Sling it. You carry both. Griggs, get Donovan's left side. I've got his right." Aldrich grabbed the drag strap on the back of Donovan's vest. "Miller." Casey lowered her rifle and looked over her shoulder. "You take point," Aldrich said. "Keep us out of sight lines. Get us to the pilot's last known coordinate." She didn't nod. She didn't acknowledge the massive shift in the team dynamic. 30 minutes ago, she was the liability in the rear. Now she was the navigator. "On my 6, Casey said. She stepped out from the shadows of the pharmacy. The sun was fully up now, baking the concrete, turning the ruined city into a convection oven. She moved with deliberate rolling steps, her eyes scanning the intersections, reading the shadows. Behind her, the procession moved agonizingly slow. Aldrich and Griggs practically carried Donovan, whose boots dragged uselessly over the rubble. O'Neill brought up the rear. He had slung his sniper rifle across his back, and he was carrying the heavy machine gun across his chest. The straps dug into his shoulders. The metal burned against his forearms. He was carrying 50 pounds of extra weight, and every step was a physical negotiation with gravity. They left a thin, intermittent trail of blood on the grey dust. It was a breadcrumb trail for anyone looking. Casey knew this. She increased her pace, forcing the men behind her to push past their physical limits. Sympathy would get them killed. Speed was their only armor now. The municipal building had once been a bank. The heavy bronze doors were blown off their hinges, lying warped and scorched on the marble steps. Inside, it was a cavernous ruin of shattered teller windows, overturned desks, and scattered worthless paper currency rotting into the carpets. "Clear," Casey whispered over the short-range comms. Aldrich and Griggs hauled Donovan into the lobby, collapsing behind a massive circular desk of polished granite. Donovan's breathing was a shallow, rapid rasp. His eyes were closed. O'Neill stumbled in last. He dropped to one knee, the heavy machine gun hitting the floor with a dull thud. He leaned his head back against the marble pillar chest, heaving his uniform entirely saturated with sweat. Casey didn't sit. She moved to the tall, narrow windows flanking the entrance. She pulled a piece of loose plywood over the shattered glass to obscure the street view, leaving only a 2-inch gap. A firing port. "Griggs, talk to me," Aldrich said, checking Donovan's pulse. It was thready, fast, too fast. Griggs had his antenna extended out of a broken window on the opposite side of the room. He swore quietly under his breath. "Still nothing, boss. The jamming is stronger here. The emitter has to be close, maybe in the building next door or on the roof. If we don't get a medevac in 20 minutes, Donovan bleeds out internally." Aldrich stated the fact without emotion. Emotion was useless data. "And we still don't have the pilot." Casey stepped back from the window. She set her rifle down on a relatively clean desk. The weapon was coated in a fine layer of white brick dust from the pharmacy roof. She popped the magazine, cleared the chamber, and caught the live round as it ejected. She placed the bullet perfectly upright on the desk. Then, pressing the release catch, she slid the bolt entirely out of the receiver. The mechanism was gritty. The dust had mixed with the lubricant, creating a mild, abrasive paste. It hadn't jammed during the fight. She knew the tolerances of her weapon, but letting it sit was asking for a catastrophic malfunction. She pulled a small nylon pouch from her chest rig. Out came a rag and a bottle of solvent. O'Neill watched her. He was panting, his arms trembling from carrying the saw. He watched her hands move over the scratched metal, the fluid, unconscious competence of her movements. She wasn't just cleaning a gun, she was tending to a lifeline. "How did you know he was behind the pillar?" O'Neill asked. His voice was hoarse. The mockery was entirely burned away. Casey didn't stop wiping the bolt face. "He fired 3 shots before I engaged him. I counted the cadence. When he retreated, he didn't have time to cross the room. The pillar was his only hard cover. His barrel length gave away his depth." She sprayed a quick burst of solvent onto the locking lugs. "You shot through 2 feet of reinforced concrete," O'Neill said. "I hand-load my rounds," Casey replied, taking a small steel brush to the extractor. "Solid copper, 220 grain. They don't mushroom, they drill. The concrete spalled. The fragmentation killed him, not the bullet." She slid the bolt back into the receiver. Click, clack. The sound was smooth again. Flawless. She chambered the round she had ejected, locked the bolt, and seated the magazine. O'Neill looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He had fired 30 rounds in the plaza and hit nothing but empty air. She had fired 5 rounds and wiped out an elite sniper element. "Griggs," Casey said, turning her attention away from the rifle. "The jamming signal. Is it omnidirectional or directional?" Griggs looked up from his radio dials. "It's a bubble. Omnidirectional. Usually cranked out from a vehicle or a heavy generator." Casey looked at Aldrich. "Boss, if the jammer is close and the pilot's beacon lead us here, they are using the pilot as bait. They put the jammer next to the pilot. Anyone who comes for the pilot loses comms and gets boxed in." Aldrich slowly nodded. He saw the tactical geometry aligning. "The snipers were the containment. We break containment, we come here. Which means," Casey continued walking back to her window port, "the ground force isn't looking for us in the plaza anymore. They know we survived. They know we're coming here." Right on cue, the faint, low rumble of heavy diesel engines vibrated through the floorboards of the bank lobby. It wasn't one vehicle, it was several. "Griggs," Aldrich ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Find the stairs, get to the roof, find that jammer and neutralize it. We need comms right now." "I can't leave Donovan," Griggs protested. "I've got Donovan," Aldrich said, his voice dropping an octave. "Move." Griggs sprinted toward the back stairwell, his boots crunching loudly on the glass. Aldrich looked at O'Neill, then at Casey. "They're rolling up the street. We hold the lobby." Miller. "Where do you want to be?" Casey surveyed the massive room. The granite telecounter in the center was excellent cover, but it lacked elevation. The mezzanine balcony above them offered a 180-degree view of the street through the high windows, but there was no overhead cover. If they threw a fragmentation grenade through the window, the shrapnel would shred the balcony. "I'm staying on the floor," Casey said. She moved to a heavy marble structural column near the front doors. "I'll take the left flank angle. I can cover the street approach." O'Neill stood up. He picked up the heavy machine gun, his muscles screaming in protest. He looked at Casey. "Where do you need me?" he asked. It wasn't a tactical question. It was a surrender. He was acknowledging her read of the battlefield. Casey pointed to the overturned bronze door lying on the steps outside the shattered entrance. "Right flank. Get behind that desk and set the bipod on the granite lip. Angle it toward the intersection. When they dismount, the trucks don't shoot the vehicles. Shoot the dismounts. Aim knee level. The recoil will walk your bursts up into their center mass." O'Neill nodded tightly. He dragged the heavy weapon over to the granite desk, dropping the bipod legs with a metallic clatter. He racked the charging handle. The rumble of the diesel engines grew louder, rattling the loose pieces of drywall hanging from the ceiling. Griggs took the stairs 2 at a time, his lungs burning in the stagnant, dust-choked air of the stairwell. 3 flights up, he hit the roof access door. It was chained shut from the outside. He didn't hesitate. He stepped back, raised his rifle, and fired 2 point-blank rounds into the lock mechanism. The steel shattered. He kicked the door open and spilled out onto the searing hot tar of the roof. The heat was an immediate physical blow. The sun reflected off the neighboring glass facades, creating a blinding glare. Griggs swept the roof, air conditioning units, exhaust vents, and a tarp. In the center of the roof, a heavy canvas tarp was draped irregularly over a large, boxy shape. A thick black cable snaked from under the tarp, leading down a ventilation shaft. The low thrumming vibration of a gasoline generator filled the air. Griggs moved cautiously, weapon raised. He reached the tarp and yanked it back. It wasn't just a jamming antenna. Slumped against the vibrating generator, his hands zip-tied behind his back. To a steel pipe was a man in a filthy, torn flight suit. His face was unrecognizable beneath layers of dried blood and bruising. His left leg was bent at an unnatural, sickening angle. It was Captain Reynolds, the downed pilot. Reynolds's eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot and unfocused. He looked at Griggs's uniform, saw the American flag patch covered in dust, and let out a dry, rattling breath. Took your time. Reynolds croaked, his lips cracking. Quiet, sir. We've got you, Griggs said, dropping to his knees. He pulled a combat knife from his chest rig and sawed through the heavy plastic zip ties binding the pilot's wrists. Griggs looked at the machinery next to Reynolds. It was a commercial-grade signal jammer, jury-rigged to a portable generator. A red light blinked aggressively on the control panel. Griggs didn't look for an off switch. He raised his rifle butt and smashed it down onto the control panel. Plastic shattered. Sparks showered over the tar. The red light died. Instantly his earpiece erupted. The rhythmic, aggressive hiss of the static vanished, replaced by the frantic, overlapping chatter of the entire theater command network. Viper base to Bravo. Actual, do you copy? I repeat, Bravo Actual. We have lost your transponder. Any station this net. This is Medivac Flight Dustoff 2. We are orbiting at grid offset, looking for a signal. Griggs pressed his push to talk. Dustoff 2, this is Bravo 3. We have the package. Immediate Medivac required. We have one critical friendly one. Critical package grid coordinate is... He rattled off their GPS location. The radio crackled back instantly. Bravo 3 solid copy on grid. Dustoff 2 is inbound. ETA is 4 mics. Be advised, drone feed shows multiple hostile technicals converging on your location. It's going to be a hot extraction. Understood, Dustoff. We are making it hot, Griggs replied. He grabbed Reynolds by the shoulder. Sir, I need you to stand. The bird is coming. Reynolds laughed, a wet, terrible sound. With this leg, I'm not standing, son. Griggs slung his rifle, hooked his arms under the pilot's armpits, and hoisted him up, dragging him backward toward the stairwell. Down in the lobby, the silence had been broken, not by the radio, but by the screeching of brakes. 3 modified pickup trucks technicals slammed to a halt in the intersection, directly outside the bank's ruined doors. The beds of the trucks were welded with steel plates, and a heavy DSHK machine gun was mounted in the back of the lead vehicle. Men poured out of the trucks. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they moved with lethal, practiced coordination. They carried AK pattern rifles, RPGs, and belt-fed machine guns. There were at least 30 of them. Casey watched them through the 2-inch gap in the plywood. Her breathing was entirely level. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by the cold mechanical calculus of survival. They're stacking up, Casey said over the internal squad comms. Hold your fire, Aldrich commanded from the center of the room. He was kneeling over Donovan with his rifle raised toward the entrance. Let them commit to the threshold. O'Neill, you do not fire until they cross the steps. O'Neill's finger was trembling on the trigger of the saw. He tightened his grip on the pistol grip until his knuckles turned white. He stared down the iron sights. He was terrified, but he didn't run. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the street. The engine of the lead technical idled loudly. The insurgents were fanning out, using the rusted cars in the street for cover, preparing to assault the bank. The gunner in the back of the lead technical racked the bolt of the DSHK heavy machine gun. The metallic clack echoed off the concrete buildings. He swiveled the massive barrel toward the dark, shattered entrance of the bank lobby. "Boss," Casey said quietly, "I have the heavy gunner." Through her scope, she could see the man's face perfectly. He was chewing a matchstick. He was confident. He thought they were dealing with trapped, wounded prey. "Take him," Aldrich said. Casey's finger applied exactly 3 pounds of pressure to the trigger of her ugly, battered rifle. The crack of the .300 Winchester Magnum shattered the morning heat. The heavy bullet punched straight through the steel gun shield of the technical, striking the gunner center mass. He was thrown backward out of the truck bed, crashing onto the asphalt. The single shot was the spark in a powder keg. The street erupted into a deafening roar of automatic weapons fire. Tracers ripped through the air, smashing into the marble pillars of the bank lobby, sending blinding showers of rock dust into the air. "Contact front!" O'Neill screamed. He squeezed the trigger of the heavy machine gun. The saw roared to life, a continuous stuttering bellow of suppressive fire. Empty brass casings rained down on the granite desk. O'Neill followed Casey's advice perfectly. He aimed low. The heavy rounds tore through the legs of the first wave of insurgents, trying to rush the steps. They fell screaming, their bodies acting as a horrific barrier for the men behind them. Casey didn't fire rapidly. She wasn't providing suppression. She was conducting surgery. She worked the bolt of her rifle with rhythmic, punishing speed. Fire, rack, load, fire. Target RPG gunner popping out from behind a sedan. Crack. The RPG fired into the sky, detonating harmlessly against a fourth-story window as the gunner dropped. Target A squad leader waving men forward from the alleyway. Crack. The waving hand disappeared. She was a metronome of violence. The heat coming off her barrel caused a visible mirage, distorting her vision through the scope. She adjusted her position an inch to the left, peering through the clear air to acquire her next target. "4 mics!" Griggs's voice blasted over the radio as he dragged the pilot down the final flight of stairs. "Dust off is 4 mics out. We need to push out to the street." "We can't push out," O'Neill yelled over the deafening chatter of his machine gun. "There's too many of them." "We don't have a choice," Aldrich barked, grabbing Donovan's vest again. "If we stay in here, the bird can't land. They'll RPG the lobby. We have to clear the intersection." Casey dropped her empty magazine onto the marble floor. It clattered loudly. She slammed a fresh one home. 5 rounds left. She looked at the sea of muzzle flashes lighting up the street. Aldrich was right. They had to advance into the fire to survive it. "O'Neill!" Casey yelled over the noise. O'Neill paused his firing, ducking behind the granite desk, as incoming rounds chewed up the marble above his head. He looked at her. "You lay down a 10-second burst on the trucks." Casey said, her eyes locked onto the street. "You don't stop pulling the trigger. I'm going out there." O'Neill's eyes widened. "Are you insane? You're a sniper. You don't push the line." Casey stood up from her cover. She didn't look at her battered rifle. She didn't have to. She knew exactly what it could do. 3 seconds, Casey said. 2, 1, now. O'Neill didn't argue. He squeezed the trigger and held it down. The Mk-48 SAW roared, spitting a continuous, blinding stream of tracer fire into the street. The sheer volume of lead chewed through the rusted chassis of the abandoned cars, shattering windshields and suppressing the dismounted insurgents. For exactly 10 seconds, the street belonged to the heavy machine gun. Casey moved. She didn't sprint upright like an action hero. She stayed low, a hunched explosive blur of motion. She cleared the shattered marble steps, diving behind the rusted husk of a taxicab, just as O'Neill's belt ran dry. The silence lasted for a fraction of a second before the enemy returned fire. The taxicab shuddered as 7.62 rounds punched through the thin aluminum doors. Casey ignored the deafening impacts inches from her head. She crawled toward the rear axle, sliding her rifle under the undercarriage. The .300 Winchester Magnum was a sniper rifle designed for extreme ranges, but out here on the pavement, it was an anti-materiel weapon. She found the second technical through her scope. The driver was trying to maneuver the truck over the curb to get a better angle on the bank entrance. Casey didn't aim for the driver. She aimed for the grille of the truck. She fired. The heavy armor-piercing round slammed into the engine block. Steam and black oil instantly erupted from the hood. The engine seized with a violent metallic screech, stalling the vehicle perpendicular to the street, creating a massive steel roadblock for the insurgents pushing up behind it. Clink-clack, the bolt cycled. The barrel was growing uncomfortably hot, the heat radiating through her thin Nomex gloves. She shifted her angle, peering around the rear bumper of the taxi. An insurgent was kneeling behind a concrete trash receptacle, hoisting the long, bulbous tube of an RPG onto his shoulder. He was aiming directly at the bank doors, where Aldrich and Griggs were about to emerge with the casualties. Distance 60 yards, point blank for her optic. She didn't have time to acquire a perfect cheek weld. She pushed the buttstock into the meat of her shoulder, floated the crosshairs over the man's chest, and squeezed. The recoil bruised her collarbone. The insurgent crumpled the RPG, firing directly into the pavement at his feet. The high-explosive warhead detonated on impact. A shockwave of concussive force washed over the street. Asphalt, dirt, and shredded metal rained down from the sky. The blast threw a half-dozen insurgents to the ground, disorienting their flank. "Moving!" Aldrich bellowed from the bank steps. Casey popped out from behind the taxi. "Covering!" She fired her remaining 3 rounds as rapidly as the bolt action would allow. It wasn't precision shooting anymore. It was calculated intimidation. The booming crack of her rifle was distinct from the chaotic chatter of the AK-47s. Every time it fired, someone died, or a piece of cover disintegrated. The enemy began to hesitate. They stopped pushing forward and started pressing themselves flat against the pavement. Aldrich and Griggs emerged into the blinding sunlight. They looked like grotesque pack animals. Aldrich had Donovan hooked over his left shoulder, gripping his plate carrier with bloody hands. Griggs was hauling the pilot Reynolds, whose broken leg dragged uselessly behind him in the dirt. They were impossibly slow. They were massive targets. "O'Neill!" Aldrich screamed over the gunfire. "Push up!" O'Neill dropped the empty saw on the bank steps. He unslung his pristine, factory-issued Mark 22 sniper rifle. It was lighter, perfectly balanced, and entirely wrong for this fight. He brought it to his shoulder, trying to find targets through his high-magnification optic. The scope was completely washed out. Between the glare of the morning sun, the thick clouds of pulverized concrete, and the smoke from the detonated RPG O'Neill, couldn't see anything but a blurry, chaotic wall of grey. The tight eye box of his expensive scope was punishing him. If he wasn't perfectly aligned, he saw nothing but black shadow. "I can't see them," O'Neill yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He lowered the rifle, trying to point shoot, but the long barrel and heavy chassis made it unwieldy. "Get your ass out here and grab the pilot." Aldrich roared, his legs buckling under Donovan's dead weight. Casey dropped her empty magazine. She reached for her chest rig. Her fingers brushed empty nylon. She was out. She had brought 40 rounds of hand-loaded ammunition, 5 for the snipers, 35 dumped into the street to break the assault. An insurgent broke from cover, sprinting toward the stalled technical to man the heavy machine gun in the back. If he reached it, he would cut Aldrich and Griggs in half. Casey didn't hesitate. She dropped her rifle, letting it hang by its 2-point sling. She drew her sidearm, a battered Glock 19, in a single fluid motion. She stepped out from behind the taxi, exposing herself completely to the street. She pushed the pistol out, aligning the iron sights. Pop, pop, pop. 3 rounds of 9mm. The insurgent stumbled, hit in the thigh, but kept dragging himself toward the back of the truck. A low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate in Casey's chest. It wasn't her heartbeat, it was the air itself tearing apart. Thwack, thwack, thwack. "Dust off is on station," Griggs screamed, his voice entirely drowned out by the noise. A shadow fell over the intersection. A massive UH-60 Blackhawk flared violently over the rooftops, its rotors pitching back to break its forward momentum. The downdraft hit the street like a physical hammer. The rotor wash created an instant blinding brownout. Decades of accumulated desert dust garbage and pulverized stone were whipped into a hurricane-force vortex. Visibility dropped to 0 in less than 2 seconds. The heat was suffocating. The noise was absolute. Casey shut her eyes against the flying gravel, her hands instinctively coming up to shield her face. She felt the heavy tires of the Blackhawk slam onto the asphalt a dozen yards away. "Move, move, move!" a crew chief screamed from the open side door of the helicopter, his voice barely cutting through the mechanical roar. Casey opened her eyes. The world was a swirling, abrasive nightmare of tan dirt. She could barely see the outline of Aldrich and Griggs stumbling toward the bird. Gunfire was still tearing through the intersection, but it was blind. The insurgents couldn't see the helicopter through the dust storm, but they were firing at the sound. Green tracers snapped through the brown haze, pinging violently against the armored fuselage of the Blackhawk. Casey pushed forward, fighting the wind of the rotors. She holstered her pistol and grabbed the handguard of her slung rifle. The metal was still blistering hot, burning through her gloves. But she didn't let go. She reached the ramp just as Aldrich collapsed, heaving Donovan onto the aluminum floor of the cabin. 2 flight medics instantly grabbed the wounded SEAL, dragging him deeper inside, ripping open fresh medical kits. Griggs was struggling with Reynolds. The pilot was entirely dead weight now, unconscious from the pain and blood loss. "O'Neill!" Casey screamed into the dust. "Where is O'Neill?" She spun around, squinting through the swirling dirt. 10 yards back near the bank, steps O'Neill was frozen. He had dropped his rifle. He was clutching his helmet, overwhelmed by the sensory overload, the deafening rotors, the blind fire, the flying debris. The pristine gear couldn't save him from the psychological crush of the moment. Casey didn't think. She lunged away from the helicopter, diving back into the blinding storm. She hit O'Neill hard, tackling him at the waist, just as a burst of AK fire chewed up the pavement where he had been standing. "Get up!" Casey roared, grabbing the heavy nylon collar of his plate carrier. She hauled him to his feet, her muscles screaming in protest. "We are leaving." O'Neill looked at her. His eyes were wide, vacant. The combat shock had finally caught him. She slapped the back of his helmet hard. "Move your feet, O'Neill." She shoved him forward, keeping her body between him and the street. They stumbled blindly through the dust. The dark maw of the Blackhawk's side door loomed ahead. Griggs and the crew chief hauled O'Neill inside. Casey was the last one on the pavement. She turned back towards the intersection. The brownout was beginning to thin as the wind blew the dust down the alleyways. The silhouettes of the insurgents were becoming visible again. They were advancing, A man stepped out from behind the disabled technical, raising an AK directly at the cockpit of the Black Hawk. Casey had no rifle ammo. Her sidearm was holstered. She reached down to her belt, unclipped a fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin, and threw it in a flat, hard arc toward the truck. Up, up, up! Casey screamed, diving headfirst onto the floor of the helicopter. Pulling pitch, the pilot yelled over the internal comms. The Black Hawk lurched violently into the sky just as the grenade detonated on the street below. The concussive blast pushed the tail of the helicopter up, sending them into a steep, stomach-dropping bank. Casey slid across the aluminum floor, her boots slamming against the opposite bulkhead. The crew chief grabbed her harness, hauling her up and locking her carabiner into the floor ring. Ping, ping, crack, rounds hammered the underside of the aircraft. One bullet punched through the thin floorboard, inches from Casey's knee, shattering the plastic casing of a medical kit on the wall. And then they were out of range. The deafening chatter of the street battle faded, replaced entirely by the deep, rhythmic, bone-rattling thwack of the rotor blades cutting through the morning air. The bird leveled out soaring high above the ruined city, banking hard toward the safety of the horizon. Inside the cabin, it was controlled chaos. The smell of JP-8 jet fuel mixed heavily with the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. The flight medics were working frantically over Donovan. They had stripped his gear away completely. One medic was squeezing bags of whole blood into an IV line, while the other applied a chest seal over a secondary shrapnel wound. Donovan was pale as a sheet, but his chest was rising and falling. Beside him, Reynolds was strapped to a litter, his broken leg splinted and secured. He was out cold, but stable. Casey sat against the bulkhead, her legs splayed out in front of her. Her body felt like it had been beaten with a bat. Every muscle trembled slightly, the inevitable crash that followed a massive adrenaline dump. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, soaked in sweat, and coated in a thick, greyish-brown paste of plaster dust and dirt. She looked down at her hands. The palms of her Nomex gloves were melted in patches where she had gripped the blistering barrel of her rifle. Her knuckles were bruised and bloody. Slowly, methodically, she unslung the battered rifle from her chest and laid it across her lap. The paint job was ruined. The khaki and brown spray paint she had carefully applied was scorched black around the chamber and peeling off in large strips along the chassis. The optic housing had taken a deep, fresh gouge from a piece of flying concrete. It was the ugliest piece of hardware in the United States military, and it had just kept 6 men alive. She popped the empty magazine out. Clatter. She checked the chamber. Clear. She let the bolt slide forward with a satisfying metallic snap. Even coated in grit and carbon, the action was perfectly true. Across the narrow cabin, O'Neill was slumped against the wall. His helmet was off, resting between his knees. He looked completely hollowed out. He didn't have his Mark 22 sniper rifle. He had dropped it in the dirt back in the plaza, or in the bank, or in the street. He didn't even remember where. The pristine, modular $15,000 piece of engineering was gone, left to be scavenged by the militia. O'Neill slowly lifted his head. He looked at Donovan, who was bleeding out onto the floor. He looked at Aldrich, who was staring out the window. His jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. Finally, O'Neill looked at Casey. He looked at the dirt caked into her hairline. He looked at the blood on her cheek from the masonry shrapnel. And he looked at the scratched, ugly rifle resting across her lap. Hours ago, a lifetime ago, he had stood in an air-conditioned armory and mocked her. He had called her weapon a rust bucket. He had questioned her place on the team. He had demanded pristine perfection. Out here, perfection didn't exist. Out here, the only thing that mattered was what worked when the world caught fire. O'Neill didn't say anything. The noise of the helicopter made conversation impossible anyway. But he didn't need words. He reached out a trembling hand, braced himself against the vibrating floor of the aircraft, and offered her a canteen of water. Casey looked at the canteen. She looked up at O'Neill's eyes. The arrogance was entirely gone. In its place was a profound, exhausted humility. He wasn't looking at a liability anymore. He was looking at the ghost who had dragged him out of hell. Casey reached out and took the canteen. She uncapped it, taking a long, slow drink of the lukewarm water. It tasted like plastic and dirt. It was the best thing she had ever swallowed. She handed it back to him, giving a single, short nod. O'Neill nodded back. He leaned against the bulkhead and closed his eyes. Casey looked back down at her lap. She pulled a ragged piece of microfiber cloth from her pouch. It was filthy, but she didn't care. She began to wipe the heavy layer of carbon and dust off the bolt face. She didn't look at the gun. She didn't need to. She knew every scratch, every dent, and every millimeter of the metal. She just wiped it down, feeling the steady vibration of the Black Hawk carrying them home, waiting for the metal to cool. That's the gritty reality of the job. It's not about how clean your gear looks on the rack. It's about what you can do with it when the absolute worst happens. If Casey's relentless push through the kill zone got your blood pumping, hit that like button right now. Share this story with anyone who respects the quiet professionals who let their actions speak louder than their egos. What was your favorite moment in the firefight? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more intense, grounded stories of survival and tactical mastery. Stay sharp, and we'll see you in the next one.